Welcome, everybody, to the 1 year anniversary of the Bookworm. We're so glad that you're joining us today for this special episode. Um, just so you know, we are recording the episode today so that later we will send you an email with the link to the recording as well as resources mentioned in today's broadcast. If you've missed any previous bookworms, you can always find those on our website as well. And I just want to give you a quick tutorial in case you are joining us on Zoom for the first time. We do like to use the chat and we miss seeing you all in person and having that camaraderie. So feel free to chime into the conversation. If you select all panelists and attendees, it helps so that everyone can see what your comments are. But you'll also notice that the conversation goes by very quickly. So because of this, if you have questions for our panelists, please put that in the Q&A section. There you can also give a thumbs up to any questions that you also have that will reorder them, it'll upvote them. And we can also post answers with the questions, or you can comment on the questions if you have additional thoughts about that question. In addition, we do have the closed captioning turned on today as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. You can change the settings for that if you go to the little CC icon. So feel free to toggle those off or change the size of the font. And I do have side-by-side mode turned on. I can only control so much of what you see. So take a moment to slide back and forth so that you can make the speaker bigger or smaller and the screen bigger or smaller. And you can also select either speaker view or gallery view, depending on whether you'd like to see one or all of us at the same time. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. All right, so if you haven't had a chance to take our poll yet, go ahead and click quickly, and I will end the results and share them. All right, so we were talking as everyone was signing on, the panelists, about whether or not we have changed our reading habits during the pandemic. And so we also were curious if you have read any of the books that we've talked about on the Bookworm. And I see that, like me, uh, lots of people have added books to their list. And in addition, people have read some of the books. Um, and there are a few people who haven't yet. And I know I've heard from some of you that watching the Bookworm, you learn a lot and don't necessarily feel like you need to read the book afterwards, but we appreciate you being here. And it looks like we have about 38% of you saying that you have read a lot more books during the pandemic. I know that most of us have a little more free time than usual. And also 34% say a few more books. So we have a lot of readers listening, and we're happy to have you. All right. So if you joined us at the beginning of the Bookworm, you know that Richard Marsh, Paul Erickson, and Sara Quashnie were our first panelists, and we're so happy to welcome them back again today. And we're going to be talking about what they've been reading, collecting, or learning about in the past year, all of which are really great topics. First, we'll be talking with Sara. So, Sara is an information resources assistant at the Clements in both reader services and with the manuscripts division. In 2015, she graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a bachelor's degree in history and art history. She returned to school for her master's in library science and graduated from the University of Illinois in August of 2017. She's been with the Clements since 2018 and has the talent for baking some amazing desserts for the staff using recipes from our culinary collection. We miss that, Sara. So tell us what you've been reading during the pandemic.
Sure. So just kind of like a reflecting back on the past year. We were kind of talking earlier at the beginning, probably read about the same amount of books, but the ways in which I've been reading them have really changed. So pre-pandemic, read a lot of books from my own collection, went to the library pretty much every week to check out print books. Pandemic hit, library closed. So I thought, take the opportunity to really start reading through all those books I've accumulated in my room. But sometimes you just want to change it up. So I started delving into the world of ebooks from the library, and I have to say, I'm really excited about them, and it's really great. Don't have to worry about overdue fines. You get your holds and can return them as soon as you're done or as soon as they arrive. So yes, that's been a lot of fun. My reading list has also expanded exponentially. There was a Reader's Advisory magazine, and they provided free access through October of last year. And so probably have like 300 books to read now on that list. In terms of reading though, so I've been reading a lot of my own, but one of the things that's really changed is I've started reading with my fiance a lot, sort of that like circa 19th century gather around the fireplace that's non-existent in the apartment. And I read aloud to him. Maybe one of us is making dinner, cleaning up the dishes, or we're going to pick up takeout. But it's been a lot of fun. We've been able to explore a lot of different things, fiction and nonfiction. I'm the history buff. He's a doctor. So I've been able to read some books and kind of share like background knowledge that I have. But we've also been delving more into books that deal with medicine, which has been a lot of fun getting his perspective on that. So the books I'm going to be talking about today, actually sliding in an additional book as a prologue to the beginning of this book. So middle February, Bookworm's coming up, got to pick something off the list that I have to read. And so I decided to go with No Man's Land, which is about two British women doctors during World War I in the military hospital they ran. I ran across this book. It came out in like April of 2020, so I kind of feel like we're coming full circle that way too, and was excited to read it. Studied a little bit of World War I in college, was mostly World War II, but always looking to expand that knowledge base. But right before I started reading that book, the hold that I had at the library came through. So I was like, okay, we got to read this now. So the first book that we read right before this was The Doctors Blackwell, which is about Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, two of the earliest women doctors in the United States. And it looks at their history, their lives, etc. But in one part of the book, during one of Elizabeth Blackwell's journeys back to England before she decided to reside there permanently, it talks about a lecture series that she was giving. A lot of women were very interested and came, and one of the women who came was a young woman named Elizabeth Garrett, who eventually got married. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman to be registered as a medical doctor in Great Britain. So that was interesting, learned that. So we finished that book, and then we moved to this book, and it actually was sort of a continuation of that story from a different angle, because one of the main people that this book follows is Louisa Garrett Anderson, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and inspired by her mother's path in medicine to follow her, etc. And it was also really interesting to see what had changed and what really hadn't for women in medicine now that we moved into the turn of the 20th century after exploring it on the American side for the most part in the 19th century. So No Man's Land follows predominantly 2 female doctors in Great Britain, Louisa Garrett Anderson and Flora Murray. Both were from upper middle class families in Great Britain. And while unconventional, both of their families supported their pursuit of medicine, and they attended medical school in Great Britain and eventually became registered doctors on the Registry of Medicine. Louisa Garrett Anderson decided to tailor more of her path in surgery, and Flora Murray was more internal medicine administrative. They met during suffragette work. Actually, Louisa Garrett Anderson's aunt was Millicent Fawcett, who headed the NUWSS. But eventually they moved over to the WSPU, moving from suffragist to suffragette. The suffragettes were a little more radical in their approaches to agitating for women's suffrage. So you've heard of like mailbox bombs and things like that, breaking windows, etc. So they met during their work on that cause, and they became good friends and likely romantic partners as well. And they spent the rest of their life, some people call it a Boston marriage, where you'd have 2 unmarried, relatively well-off independent women with careers living together. But Wendy Moore, the author of this book, also looks at their correspondence and things like that, asserts that there probably was some form of romantic component to the relationship as well. They worked at a variety of hospitals in London. For the most part, women were forced to work in medicine related to women and children. It was sort of frowned upon if you practiced medicine on men. So they went on to found a hospital for children called the Harrow Road Hospital for Children. Did a lot of work with poorer families in London, etc. So World War I starts in 1914 in Great Britain, and they decide they want to do as good suffragettes do and use deeds, not words, in terms of their efforts for the war effort. So they go to the British War Department, they offer their services as doctors, they're rejected. So they end up contacting the French Red Cross, who agrees to have them come over to France and work on their behalf. And they set up a hospital at a Claridge's hotel in Paris. That goes pretty well. They're very efficient and effective, treat a lot of patients, end up going on to establish a field hospital at a summer resort in Wimereux, Belgium. And then during this period, they come into contact with the head of the, let me make sure I get his title right, the Director General of Army Medical Services, Alfred Keogh, who was very skeptical about women being successful in medicine, especially military medicine, when they previously had no experience in military medicine and no previous experience treating. But he visits their hospital, sees just how well run it is, how many surgeries they're doing, how many people they're treating, and he sort of ends up doing a 180 and becomes a staunch advocate for them and encourages them to set up a military hospital back in London. So that's sort of the early part of the book. The bulk of the book covers their work once they've established their hospital in London, which went on to become called the Endell Street Military Hospital. It was in an old workhouse in London. And it was widely reputed at the time, and now by historians looking back is one of the most efficient hospitals, military hospitals in London during World War I. Largely staffed almost entirely by women. I think they had a few male orderlies, but as the war went on and they wanted to get more men to the front, they were replaced by women, a lot of volunteers as well, particularly upper class women trying to do their part for the war effort. They were also known for their high morale and just a very cheerful spirit around. So a couple interesting things about their work in the war. They were one of the early hospitals to really be using X-ray technology to examine where bones were fractured, etc. They also were early pioneers of BIP, which was an antiseptic treatment that ended up saving quite a number of limbs and lives. So just really interesting overall reading about not just this hospital, but also attitudes toward women during the war. A lot more women were admitted to medical school during this time period. As many people are familiar, women were pretty much taking over any job they could, so men could go to the front. The Women's Suffrage Act was finally passed in Great Britain during this period. So a lot of really positive things. Book ends a little bit, you get a little bit of some dark times though at the end of the book, looking both at the backlash against women in the workforce following the war. It was kind of expected that they would just go back to being in the home, raising families. Yeah, you did a great job in medicine during the war, but that's because we were desperate and stop applying. We're not going to be giving jobs to you, etc. The other thing that was really interesting is really reading about that context between the 1918 flu pandemic and the end of World War I. So throughout the war, very hard work, they're overwhelmed with patients. There's air raids at night, just getting through the day-to-day, and they really were able to maintain a good overall atmosphere of efficiency and high morale, etc. But in November 1918 and through that winter into 1919, the 1918 influenza pandemic hits. They lose a number of their staff to it. They said that's really when morale fell to an all-time low. There wasn't really much they could do because while they could learn more about surgery and pioneer these innovative techniques, with the flu, it was just kind of this, what are we doing? We're powerless to stop it. We just need to treat them and hope that they make it through. So that is kind of an interesting comparison to, I think, how many people have felt over the past year, and it didn't make, a little over 100 years feel so far away. In the end, Endell Street Military Hospital closes in 1920, and Flora Murray and Louisa Gary Anderson go back into more private practice, etc. And you can read the book to find out what happened. That's about it. So I encourage you all to read it. It's not a super long book, but really interesting. She touches on a lot of different aspects of medicine in the wards too. And it's also kind of fun to hear about their social events as well. They kind of went all out for Christmas and things like that.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And these seem like perfect books to read with your fiance, marrying doctors and history together. And of course, good for Women's History Month too.
Yes.
So I know that you're always looking at the Clements collections. Have you found did this make you think of anything in the collections that's related to these books?
Sure. So there were a couple. First of all, I hadn't realized that the Weld-Grimké collection, which is one of the better known collections at the Clements, actually has a decent amount of material related to the Blackwell family. It turns out that I think it was a daughter or son of the Weld-Grimké marriage. They were in touch with mostly Henry Blackwell and his children. Henry Blackwell was the brother of Elizabeth and Emily. And one thing I learned in the book on the Blackwells is that he married Lucy Stone, who was a prominent American suffragette. And so between the Weld-Grimké family's efforts on abolition and women's suffrage and these other 19th century movements, it seems like they were relatively close, that they were exchanging regular correspondence with Blackwell and Stone, and I believe their daughter, Sarah, if I'm not mistaken. We do have a lot of World War I material at the Clements too. I'd say a lot of it is American because we're a research library that specializes in American history. But people are traveling to Great Britain and France, and there were some Americans who went to volunteer or serve on the Western Front before the United States officially entered the war. We do have a photograph album that was put together by a surgeon during World War I, American surgeon who went over and served in another of the base hospitals in England. So these were hospitals that same level as the Endell Street Hospital, but run more directly by the War Department. We have a very small collection of letters related to an American woman who went to serve as a telephone operator on the Western Front in France. And there's some interesting articles about her. I think the New York Times just published like a you know, obituary for her said she wasn't properly recognized when she actually passed away a couple years ago. So Grace D. Banker, she was sort of one of the heads of the Hello Girls, as they were called. I think we have another collection as well that I put in the collections for later that dealt with a young man who was working with the ambulance corps, or at least alongside them. So you get kind of a little more of that American side of the experience in Europe. And there were American volunteers at the Endell Street Military Hospital too later in the war. I think through the suffrage contacts, they reached out to people in New York, and the women gathered up a number through the Red Cross and came over and volunteered. And two of them, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, were American educators and suffragettes, and they went on to become good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. So I think the author researched in the Eleanor Roosevelt papers and related collections for their side of the story.
Interesting. Yeah. So lots of connections there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Glad to hear some of the things that you've been reading and have you share again with us. In case anyone joined us late, if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can put those in the Q&A section. And now we'll move on to Richard Marsh. Dick is a member of the Clements Library Associates Board of Governors and is president of the Winston Churchill Society of Michigan and a walking encyclopedia of all things Churchill. So Dick is going to share with us a bit about his collection of inscribed association copy books, which he had plenty of time to read at home during the pandemic. And so Dick, tell us a little bit about what an association copy book is.
Well, an association copy book is a book associated with a famous person. I mean, it can be signed by, inscribed by, from the library of, etc. And I think the most interesting aspects of association copy books are the inscribed books. Often there's an interesting story behind the inscription. And that's what I'd like to deal with today.
Oh, that's great. So what was your first association copy book? How did you come to be collecting these?
Well, I've been collecting association copy books, original doc on British history with a particular emphasis on Winston Churchill and his era for at least 50 years. And I can remember being with my wife in London in July of 1971 on vacation. And we're walking down a street in London, and we walked by a bookstore. And I happened to peek into the bookstore, and it's the former Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, signing his memoirs. So I go in, I purchase the memoirs, stand in line, and when I get to the head of the line, I ask the former Prime Minister, please inscribe the book to me, Richard Marsh. And Wilson looks up and says, aha, I had a Richard Marsh in my cabinet. And he went ahead and signed the book. So that, I think that was my first association copy. And I've always been enamored with original documents and associations. It connects me with the individuals more to know that they've had the book in their hands, they've signed it, etc.
Yeah.
So if I can go on in terms of inscribed books, as I mentioned, I think they're important because there can be an interesting story behind the inscribed book. And one example would be an inscription that merely reinforces a known historical fact. And I've got a book from my collection that was inscribed by Queen Victoria, and that fits this particular category. And the book is Prince Albert's speeches. And Prince Albert, of course, was her husband. And Prince Albert passed away in December 1860. And from that time on, and Victoria lived for over 40 more years. And from that time on, she was known as the widow of Windsor. She always wore black, rarely went out into the public. And this inscription, I think, reinforces that bereavement that went on for over 40 years. And it says, to the Earl of Carlisle, in recollection of former happy, blessed days, from the beloved, great, and good Prince's broken-hearted widow, Victoria R. Windsor Castle, March 14, 1863. So there's a good example of a book that reinforces a known historical fact. Now, some books are just interesting because of their humorous inscription. And another example from my library is the collected plays of George Bernard Shaw. And the inscription in this book is, now read it, Mr. Fred Chapman of Manchester, evidently a Chapman of the Manchester School, has speculated in this edition deluxe on the chance of my autographing it and thereby enabling him to sell it at a considerable profit. I trust that the few 100,000 or so of his fellow purchasers will, before following his example, apply the Kantian test to their conduct and ask themselves, what would happen to me if I devoted the rest of my life to signing copies for them? Still, to reward Mr. Chapman's cheek, G. Bernard Shaw, 9 January 1935. Now, Shaw had a rather acerbic wit, but he got a taste of his own medicine in an exchange with Winston Churchill in the 1930s. And the exchange went something like this. Shaw to Churchill, dear Winston, enclosed are two tickets to the opening performance of my new play. Bring a friend if you have one. Churchill to Shaw, dear George Bernard, unable to attend the opening performance of your new play. Please send 2 tickets to the second performance, if there will be one. Now I'd like to go on to the primary book that I want to discuss today. I purchased this book about 6 months ago. It's called Nation Terrorized by Gerhard Sager. And I think that this book is really good because it tells about a historical, interesting incident that I'd never heard of, and I think is not widely known by the public. And the inscription in the book reads, Lady Astor, as a very little sign of a very great thankfulness, Gerhard Sager, Sager being the author. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Nancy Lady Astor. She is famous today as being the first female member of parliament to sit in the House of Commons. She was elected in 1919. And it's somewhat ironic because Nancy Lady Astor was an American. She was not a Brit. She was married to Waldorf Astor. This is the same Astor's family that made gigantic sums of money in New York, but a few of them went back to England, and including Waldorf, her husband, and her husband's father. Her husband's father sat as a hereditary peer in the House of Lords, and her husband Waldorf was the MP representing Plymouth in the House of Commons. Well, Waldorf's father dies. He's elevated to the House of Lords. The seat's vacant in the Commons. Lady Astor runs for it. She's elected in 1919. She had a very prickly relationship with Winston Churchill. First of all, because Churchill did not like the fact of women in the House of Commons in 1919. And he knew her socially, but he snubbed her. He wouldn't even talk to her. And I should note that his views changed 180% went full circle. In the 1950s, there was a college at Cambridge that was named after Churchill College, Cambridge. Winston insisted that all people that were admitted to that college, that men and women should be admitted on an equal basis. And that was the first college at Cambridge to do so. Now, the second problem between Winston and Nancy was that in the 1930s, Nancy was an appeaser. She was a follower of Neville Chamberlain and supported the appeasement policies towards Nazi Germany. And of course, Winston was one of the great anti-appeasers of the 1930s. Now, this prickly relationship, I think, was very well exhibited by a humorous anecdote that occurred in the 1930s when they were at a dinner party together. And the hostess made a very bad decision. She put Nancy and Winston together at the dinner table. And after a while, after numerous arguments, Nancy, clearly exasperated, blurted out, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee." To which Winston immediately responded, "Nancy, if I was married to you, I would drink it." So anyways, that's a little background on Lady Esther. Let me tell you now about Gerhard Sager, the author of this book. This book, to my knowledge, is the first book ever written about a German concentration camp. And it was, I have the English language edition printed in Chicago in 1935. The first edition was in German, printed in Prague in 1934. Sager was elected as a representative in the German Reichstag, which is their parliament, in 1930 in the Weimar Republic. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party, which was a left-leaning party. There were elections in the fall of 1932 in Germany, and the Nazis gained a large number of seats in the Reichstag. Didn't have a majority, but they had a large number of seats. So Hitler had to be recognized. The most powerful person in Germany at that time was the octogenarian president, Paul von Hindenburg, who then made Hitler chancellor, which was like the #2 position. Then there was a terrible fire in the Reichstag in January of 1933. Happened during the middle of the night. And of course, the Nazis blamed the communists and all the left-leaning political parties in Germany because the fire was clearly started by arsonists. And in fact, the fire was started by the Nazis. So anyways, that led to something akin to martial law. And the communists and other left-leaning people were rounded up and put in these work camps. And then introduced into the Reichstag was something called the legislation, which in essence would give Hitler the whole Germany by decree, really making him a dictator. And Sager, who Reichstag, spoke vehemently against the enabling legislation. Well, the legislation passed, and Sager was immediately arrested for speaking out against Hitler. And he wasn't charged with a crime. There was no trial. There's no writ of habeas corpus. Once you're in, he was thrown into the concentration camp called Oranienburg, just outside of Berlin. And this book details his experiences in Oranienburg. And it should be noted that concentration camps at that point were really work camps. They were not killing centers that they turned into during World War II. However, Sager did witness 2 or 3 instances where guards beat prisoners to death. And he's very specific in the book of identifying the murdered person, the guards that did it, where did it occur, when did it occur. And in the English language edition, he notes the particular German prosecutors and also members of the German judiciary that this book, he sent this book to. He'd hoped that his book could be used to prosecute these guards. Well, fat chance of that occurring in Hitler's Germany. So what happened then, he was in Oranienburg for 6 months, and he describes in detail how he escapes. He's out on a work camp, and he'd been going to the same place for about a week, and he planned his escape, and he managed to escape, and he gets into Prague, and he writes the book, and it is published in Prague in German under the title Oranienburg. Well, the Nazis immediately then retaliated by grabbing Sager's wife, Elizabeth, and their 2-year-old daughter and slapping them into the Roslau concentration camp. And although Frau Sager wasn't subject to any physical torture, she was subject to a certain amount of mental torture. I mean, the guards would taunt her by saying, you know, your husband, he's in Prague and he's living the high life with his German Jewish mistress. So they taunt her, and of course that wasn't true. So how does Lady Astor come into this story? Sager makes his way to London. Lady Astor is a prominent MP. He goes to see her. She's part of the Conservative Party. She arranges where Sager can speak about his situation with his wife and daughter to these Conservative MPs. Then she gets a number of female MPs together, and they go see the German ambassador to the UK. There's a guy named Leopold von Heist at that point, who was the fellow before von Ribbentrop. And they, in essence, threaten him that either you make arrangements to get this wife and child out of that concentration camp, or we're going to make life very difficult for you in the House of Commons. So he agrees. But they still had to work out all the details. And it just so happened, they needed visas and whatever, that there was a lady MP in Berlin at the time, and her name was Mavis Tate. And they contact Mavis, and she got to work out how to administratively make this happen. And she thinks to herself, who should I approach in Hitler's inner circle? And she comes up with the name of Ernst Putzi Hamstagel. He's German-American. His mother was American, Harvard class of 1909. Knew Franklin Roosevelt, was a friend of his. They were at Harvard together. And they go see Hamstagel, and Hamstagel works it out, gets the visas. And so the wife and child are released from Roslau in the end of 1933. And Mavis Tate gives an interview to the American Hebrew Journal. And I'd just like to read to you what was reported in that journal about the reunion of the family. In such a little while it seemed, after all the hideous delays and doubts, we were slipping downward out of the sky, and the familiar train of Croydon Airport was just under us. At our landing place stood the cheerful Sager, smiling through tears of joy. There was plenty of crying, plenty of laughter, greetings and congratulations, and the little family was one again. English determination had overcome German obstinacy, and the Nazis had lost their important pawn. So I'd like to just, in my conclusion, I'd tell you what happened to these players, these participants in this drama during World War II. Well, first of all, Sager and his family didn't stay long in England. They emigrated on to the United States. Sager edited a German language newspaper devoted to democracy and in opposition to fascism. He helped cooperate with the US government during the war. Now I want to tell you the sad story about Mavis Tate. At the end of the European War in May of 1945, Churchill sent 10 MPs, including Mavis Tate, to the Buchenwald concentration camp to report back to the House of Commons on the horrors committed in Buchenwald. And Mavis Tate was part of that group. They did a newsreel about it. Mavis Tate actually narrated the newsreel, but she was never the same after that visit to Buchenwald. She had various illnesses. She had terrible headaches. She had terrible insomnia. She committed suicide in 1947. Ironically, she committed suicide by gassing herself with a gas stove. So what happened to Ernst Putzi Hamstakel? And he did his memoirs, and this happens to be his memoirs, the English language edition, which is called Hitler, the Missing Years. And he was known in the history books as Hitler's piano player. He was very musical. Hitler would call him up late at night, Putzi, come over and play the piano for me, whatever. Well, he fell out of favor with Hitler in the late 1930s. And if you can believe his memoirs, the SS devised a plan to assassinate him. They were going to take him up in an airplane, fly him over Spain during the Spanish Civil War, push him out of the airplane without a parachute. Well, Putzi found it out in advance and made his way to Great Britain and escaped from Germany. But when the war broke out, he was put in an internment camp in England. And the only reference in these memoirs to Gerhard Sager is 2 sentences where he's critical of Mavis Tate for supporting the fact that he was interned, and that was like she showed no gratitude for what he had done for her. That's the only reference to this story in Putzi's memoirs. Well, they moved him then to an internment camp in Canada, and he managed to contact his Harvard friend, Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt moved him to an estate in Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. And he was under house arrest, although that's kind of a joke because for a while, his guard was a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant who just happened to be Putzi's son. So the house arrest wasn't very effective. But during the war, Putzi helped Roosevelt by supplying psychological profiles of the Nazis to FDR. His profile of Hitler ran for 68 pages. He also interpreted current events that were going on in Germany for Roosevelt. And this book contains a wonderful story, and it's too long to get into right now. Churchill and Hitler never met face to face, but they came oh so close in the end of 1932. Putzi tried to arrange it, and there's about 4 or 5 pages in this book that describe that near meeting, which is very, very interesting. But after the war, Putzi returns to Munich. And every once in a while, he would return to the United States. He liked to come back to his Harvard reunions, and he lived to be a very old man. And the last reunion that he came back to was his 65th Harvard reunion in 1974. And as a musician, he regaled the Harvard band with stories about their composers of the Harvard fight songs. Not a word was said about his Nazi past. Now, finally, what happened to Nancy Lady Astor? She was an MP for 26 years, 1919 to 1945. She was swept out of office in 1945 in the labor landslide victory where Clement Attlee became prime minister. She lived a long life. She died at the age of 84 in 1964. 2019 was the 100th anniversary of her election as an MP for Plymouth. And to commemorate that event, the citizens of Plymouth erected a very beautiful statue of her in downtown Plymouth. Well, last summer, in the summer of 2020, that statue was defaced. And someone spray painted a single word on the statue, Nazi. And I think with the story that came to light to me, at least, by this inscription to Lady Astor from Gerhard Sager, I think it's clear to me that even though Lady Astor was an appeaser, was a supporter of the policies of Neville Chamberlain, she certainly wasn't a Nazi, nor was she a Nazi sympathizer. So that concludes my remarks.
Dick, I love that. I can't believe you can read a couple books a month, because you take reading to a whole new level by finding all of these connections and filling out the rest of the story. And I think your concluding remarks about all of these players certainly shows how complicated people are, and how depending on what portion of their history you're looking at, how you might view them. I mean, that's the historical view many times with people is certainly complicated, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good observation.
So, well, thank you so much. Paul, I'm happy to have you back on the Bookworm as well. Paul joined us at the Clements Library as the Randolph G. Adams Director in 2020, just in time for the pandemic. And he is especially interested in 19th century printing, and is going to share with us some interesting observations today.
Right. So first of all, I want to thank Angela and Anne and Tracy for keeping the Bookworm going for the past year. It's hard to imagine that a year ago we got together for what we thought was going to be, 2-3 months of online programming, and then things would go back to normal. And we all look back now and realize how naive we were. So thanks to them for their great work, and it's great to be on with Sarah and Dick again. So today I want to talk about money. I'm in part of my job is fundraising, so I guess I always want to talk about money, but I want to talk about 19th century money today. I'm starting out with one of my favorite books that's related to my own research, which is on the screen here, City Reading, Written Words in Public Spaces in Antebellum, New York by David Henkin. It came out in 1998. And it's a great book about the textual world of antebellum New York. He writes about the city as a space that was just covered in words. So that you see the cover there, it's a vignette from a print called The Bill Poster's Dream, which we have in the Clements collection. And there were words everywhere in public spaces in New York City. So there were signs and banners and people wearing sandwich boards, and there were newspapers all over the place. And David writes really well about the way that the urban environment was a textual environment. So this book changed my thinking about what antebellum city life was like, which is one of my main interests. And his last chapter in the book is about paper money as a form of print that was in circulation in antebellum New York. And it's a really good chapter. He talks about how people used money and how money, paper money, sort of conditioned interactions between people who didn't know each other. But he says, we don't really know much about who used paper money and how. And that was 22 years ago. So fast forwarding to the book that I'm really going to talk about today, which came out just last year, Banknotes and Shin Plasters, The Rage for Paper Money in the Early Republic by Josh Greenberg. And full disclosure, Josh is a good friend of mine. One of my main reading projects for the pandemic has been to read books that friends of mine have written, and they keep writing books. So I stay busy. And that's on the next slide. So this book started actually at a conference panel that Josh and I were on together at the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic in 2007, I think. And Josh was talking about some incidents that he had read about of people in the 19th century tearing banknotes in half of different denominations and pasting or sewing them together to create new bills. So you could tear a $10 bill in half and a $5 bill in half and paste one half of each together, and you had a bill for $7.50. And Tim Guilfoyle, who's a historian at Loyola in Chicago, was chairing the panel. And he said, well, I don't see why you can't do that now. And he took a $5 bill and a $1 bill out of his wallet and tore them in half. And he had brought tape along and taped them together and made Josh a $3 bill, which he still has in his office. And that was kind of how this book project started. So this book is a great explanation of how money worked in the first half of the 19th century, which may be something that not a lot of people have thought about, but from the standpoint of the history of reading, the history of print, the history of everyday life, it's incredibly important. And he explains this really complicated system better than anything else I've read. And just as an added note for folks who are listening to the Bookworm, it's a great Michigan story. So I'm just going to sort of give a little bit of context about how money worked in the 19th century, and then talk a bit about what Josh talks about in the book. So there was no federal currency before 1863. That's when the National Currency Act is passed, and the federal government starts issuing greenbacks. Things that look kind of like what we use as money now. And the most important thing, I mean, read your money, but the most important thing that all of our money says is this bill is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So before 1863, there was no paper money that was legal tender. Legal tender means that if you offer it in exchange for a debt, the person has to accept it. So before 1863, all the paper money that was in circulation was issued by state banks. And there were a ton of state banks. So just to give you a sense, and there was paper money in the colonial era. The colonies issued their own money, but it really takes off in the antebellum period. So in 1811, there were 88 banks in the United States. In 1820, there were over 300. A bunch of banks go out of business in the 1820s, so that number goes down. But by 1840, there are over 900 banks in the United States, and by 1860, there are 1,500 banks. All of these banks are issuing their own money in multiple denominations. So there were over 10,000 different banknotes in circulation in the United States in 1860. So think about how complicated it would be to try to just live a life and buy things and sell things when there are over 10,000 different notes in circulation, and the kind of challenges that would present. And so that's the context that people were living in the 19th century. And on top of that, there were these things called shin plasters that weren't really money. They were functioned locally as currency. They were things issued by merchants, by churches, by associations that said, you can exchange this for $3 worth of goods. Sometimes it was only good at the place that it issued it. Sometimes you could exchange it and it would work locally. So there's this other world of paper money that's in circulation. So to do anything in antebellum America required a huge amount of knowledge. So you had to know how the financial system worked. You had to know how to read, because you had to be able to read all these banknotes and tell where they were from, where the bank was. You had to have a lot of visual literacy, because there was a huge amount of counterfeiting. And one of the main ways to tell if bills were fake or not was to be able to look at the images. And there were these books circulated called counterfeit detectors, which sort of said, okay, these are the bills that are in circulation. This one is fake. And the way you can tell it's fake is that the horse only has 3 legs, not 4 legs. So it was just this really complicated financial system. But the hardest thing about it was figuring out discounting. So almost no banknotes were worth what they said on their face. And their value decreased the farther away you got from the bank that issued them. So the logic behind banks issuing banknotes is that you could, in theory, take a $5 bill from the Bank of Ann Arbor and bring it to the Bank of Ann Arbor, and they would give you $5 in gold or silver. no bank had as much hard money on hand as they had currency in circulation. And banks had a vested interest in making sure that none of their money, none of their banknotes actually came back. So banks would try to get their money into circulation as far away from the bank as possible. So they would pay people who were called carpetbaggers, who would go out with bags full of money to put money into circulation far away from the bank. And so depending on how far away you were from the bank that issued the money, you had to calculate what was called the discount rate. So if you had a note from a Michigan bank and you were in Ohio, maybe the discount rate would be 3%. If you were in Philadelphia, maybe it would be worth 10% because it was much harder to actually get your money back. So that was the kind of calculation that everybody had to do in every financial transaction, no matter how big or how small, whether you were buying something that cost 50 cents or you're buying something that cost $50. And so it put an incredible strain on just everybody, on everyday people, trying to figure out what money was worth and how they could sort of function. And there were lots of novels and stories written about this. It was especially baffling to people from overseas. James Kirkpauling wrote a great story about a Frenchman who arrives in Charleston, South Carolina, and travels north to New York. And at every stop, the money that he has changed is worth progressively less. And by the time he gets to New York, he's broke when he had arrived with $1,000 because his money just keeps getting discounted again and again the farther away he gets from South Carolina. And so Michigan plays a really prominent role in this story because Michigan's banking laws were really loose. And especially in 1837, there's a banking act passed in Michigan, and the number of banks goes from 9 to 40 kind of overnight. And Michigan banks are notorious nationwide for issuing money that's not worth anything. They are notorious for going out of business really fast. And so like there's always money in circulation in the system from banks that don't exist anymore. So it's technically worthless, but it's still, people need money, so it's still being exchanged. And the Bank of Monroe, Michigan in particular, was notorious as a hotbed of lousy banks. So the next couple slides are of banknotes from banks in Monroe, Michigan, that give you a sense of what some of this money looked like. So there is James Monroe there, the namesake of Monroe, Michigan. And the Bank of Monroe is a fascinating story that Josh tells in the book. It is taken over by the Latter-day Saints. So when the Latter-day Saints are chased out of Kirtland, Ohio, they were trying to establish a bank, and they wind up buying the Bank of Monroe. And so for a while, it is the Bank of the Mormon Church. So this the Bank of Monroe is kind of notorious nationwide for issuing worthless money. If you can go to the next slide, Anne. This is the Bank of River Raisin, another Monroe bank. You'll see that they've misspelled raisin on the banknote. They later corrected it and changed it to IN. But again, this sort of just baffling collection of images. They're like I don't know why William Penn is on there. The Native American is sort of shooting that bald eagle. And then if you can go to the next one, Anne. So yeah, Merchants and Mechanics Bank, also from Monroe. That bustling commercial scene there in the center vignette is almost certainly not Monroe, Michigan in the late 1830s. I don't think there were tall-masted ships that big coming to Monroe, nor was there a building that large. But there's sort of scenes of patriotism with the eagle and industry with the farmer and commercial activity. It's important that the back sides of almost all banknotes in this period were blank. And so Josh does a great job in the book of showing how what everyday people did with their money. And a lot of times they wrote stuff on the back, and they would just use them as sort of scrap paper. They would do math sort of for the commercial transactions that they were involved in. They would write complaints about how worthless the money was, or how they didn't like the banking system. And there are some really sad and poignant notes that people write saying, I lost all my money gambling, and this is the last $10 that I have. And so, but they functioned as paper, as a writing surface, as well as money. And the book does a really great job of showing sort of who benefited from this really complicated financial system, which was unsurprisingly the banks, and who suffered by it. And it was especially people who didn't have very much money, because it's one thing to figure out a 5% discount on a $10 or a $20 note. But if you're a working person and most of your transactions are in the 5 to 50 cent range, and you don't have coins to do those transactions, it's just really complicated to get banknotes in small amounts to do those kinds of to engage in those kinds of transactions in your daily life. Employers would typically get banknotes that they knew were worth less than face value, and so they would buy them at a discount and then pay their workers their wages in those banknotes. Workers didn't have contracts saying you have to pay me in currency from a local bank. So automatically people's wages were being paid to them in currency that was worth less. And so, they suffered financially because of the system. Native American tribes had arrangements where they were paid annuities by the federal government for having surrendered some of their land. The agents who were responsible for those interactions with indigenous groups would pay them in currency that was worth less. And so, the system was gamed in a lot of ways by the banks, who were in control of the money supply and profited through the system. And so everyday people suffered by it. So if you can go to the last picture, Anne. So the Washtenaw Bank was nationally notorious for worthless money, and there would be jokes in books published in New York about people trying to pay for things with Washtenaw money and being said, no, you can't come to this play because your money is worthless. So there was a lot of local notoriety. And then the very last one is from a bank in Saginaw, the People's Bank. And this gives you a sense of sort of like what the paper money system looked like just before federal money is introduced. So this is from 1862. It's a banknote for 10 cents. You can only redeem it for currency when you have 10 of them, as the note says. So it just gives it serves as kind of an index of how complicated financial life was in the antebellum decades. You had to know where Flint was. You had to know how to read. You had to understand these images. And it just put incredible pressure on everyday Americans. And then federal currency is introduced, and suddenly people don't have to read their money anymore, because they can sort of look at it and see what president is on it, what number is on it, and assume that it's worth what it is. And the epilogue of the book, Josh talks about how that sort of loss of financial literacy has been a problem, in things like the financial crisis of 2008. People didn't understand the kinds of financial instruments that were in circulation, and that in a lot of cases they were buying, that wound up tanking the economy because they weren't used to thinking about different kinds of financial instruments as being exchanged in the market. So I will stop there, but it's a great book, and a lot of great Michigan stories about wildcat banks, and they're all in Southeast Michigan. There's the Bank of Ypsilanti makes a wonderful appearance, so highly recommend it.
Thank you, Paul. All right, so everybody, we will answer some questions if you have them. Put them in the Q&A. I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping things before we do that. Reminder that the next episode is April 16th. We'll do a fellow spotlight with Sarah Swedberg about her new book, Liberty and Insanity in the Age of the American Revolution. So we hope that you'll join us again for that one. Once you've registered, you're registered for future episodes, so you don't have to register again. And hopefully our reminder system will be up and running next month. In addition, we had a lot of requests over the past year to reopen our pop-up shop for Bookworm shirts. And so in honor of the reunion, we do have Bookworm shirts available, as well as a version of our Immerse Yourself in History from our grand reopening in 2016. For those of you who got the soft style t-shirts last time and raved about them, all of the t-shirts are indeed the soft style t-shirts, and we also have sweatshirts available. So take a look at that. You have until April 11th to place orders, and then Underground Printing will print your order after that and ship it out. We also, of course, appreciate your gifts to help make these programs and others possible. So if you are able, please make a contribution to the Clements Library. And if you'd like to sponsor a future episode of the Bookworm, you can contact me or Anne. All righty. Let's see if we have some questions. All right. So, Paul, Sarah is asking, weren't there a lot of satirical prints parodying banknotes that looked like banknotes?
Yeah, there were. There were satirical banknotes. There were counterfeit banknotes that weren't really counterfeit. There's a great David Henkin has a picture of one in his book that is from a bank supposedly from a bank in New York, and it looks like the regular bank's bill. It just says that the directors of this bank promised not to pay the bearer the $3 in currency. So it's not counterfeit. It's just kind of mean. So yeah, people were producing fake money all the time. People were defacing bills, and sometimes they would have their bills rejected because they had, drawn a mustache or on someone or put a pipe in their mouth. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's really useful to think about money as a form of printed text that's in circulation, right? Because any kind of print is the target of satire, and money was no different.
Right. So Sarah also points out that she has a couple of examples at the Library of Congress. So
right,
wants to check those out. All right. So does anybody, audience members, if you have any other questions, put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, do any of you have any questions for each other as panelists?
So Dick, I have a question about association copies. Are they something that you focus specifically on in your collecting, or you sort of have just sort of fallen into acquiring some?
I really put a focus on collecting the association copies. Like I mentioned, they have a certain significance for me. And so in the most recent collecting interest for the last 2 or 3 years is I focused on people that were important to Winston Churchill, that were of his era, of his acquaintance, etc. And every book I've purchased, most of them have been memoirs that have been signed or inscribed. And I have a fairly large collection of those books at the present time. So it's something I really focus on.
Ernie is asking another question about the banknotes, wondering what, when it says promises to redeem, what would they redeem the note in?
So the fiction, I mean, the sort of thing that made the system work was the idea that you could take a banknote to a bank, and they would give you silver or gold in exchange for the face value of the banknote. In order to get a charter, banks were required to have a certain amount of specie in their vaults. Josh Greenberg does a great job of explaining how, especially in Michigan, banks got around this. So when an inspector would come to visit a bank before issuing a charter, some banks would have a barrel full of nails with only like 2 inches of gold coins on top, and they would say like, "Oh, look, we've got the standard in Michigan after the 1837 law was that banks had to have $50,000 in specie on hand." And so they would say, "Look, we've got this big barrel of money." Other banks would sort of pool their specie together, and so there would be one big chest of gold coins that would be sort of shared among banks. So when they knew that an inspector was coming, they would put that box of money in a wagon and take it over to the bank in the next town over, so that it would look like they had money on hand. So in theory, they would give you hard money in exchange for the banknote. In practice, that almost never happened, but that's why banks were interested in having their money circulating as far away as possible from the bank, because it made it less likely that somebody would actually show up and ask for gold in exchange for the notes. And then when banks refuse payment on their notes, that's when they would close, which they did all the time.
Oh boy, lots of scheming going on.
Right.
And on the Monroe notes, it says Michigan security note. What does that mean?
I think it doesn't mean anything. I think it was just something that they said to make them sound legitimate. There were some places where groups of banks sort of banded together. The best known example is the Suffolk Bank in Massachusetts, where those banks agreed to honor each other's notes, and they would sometimes say Suffolk security note or something like that on the banknote, so that if you had a banknote from one bank, you could exchange it at another member bank. In Michigan, I don't think it meant anything.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Cheryl's wondering, Dick, if in your research, if you know anything about the US or British reactions to the early disclosure of concentration camps.
Well, I'm not really an expert on that, but I think that they were out, and there were protests and meetings in New York City against them. But like I say, I think that there was no realization as World War II went on that they were the killing centers that they turned out to be. I think that was a surprise and a terrible shock for many people. And like I mentioned, the Oranienburg experience of Gerhard Sager was not a killing center. It was a work camp, basically. But I don't think the public really realized, and even the leadership, Churchill and Roosevelt, really realized the extent and terrible nature of the horrors committed in the concentration camps in World War II.
Yeah, it's too bad that Gerhardt's warning wasn't taken a little more seriously, I guess. But again, it's hard to. But thank you for that. Right. So, Sarah, Caroline has a question for you. She's always interested in the way that our understanding of early 20th century is being recovered by looking at, and she says, duh, women. Thank you for your description of the medical profession. Do you think that women as wartime doctors helped open the profession more widely to women?
So this was kind of an interesting thing to look at that they talk about in the book. So I think during World War I, the fact that you had these women successfully operating a military hospital certainly helped. And during the war, a lot of the medical schools that were previously closed to women were open to women. and they were getting jobs because back then medical education was a little bit different, but you still had to do essentially a residency internship at a hospital to really get those hands-on skills. But after the war, you know, I knew that after, you know, World War I and even to an extent World War II, society was kind of like pushed to shift back to where they had been before in terms of men in the workplace and women at home. But I hadn't realized how much of a backlash there was. There was some really nasty things said to women, and rules put into place. So one of the women from Australia who actually came to England to work in the military hospital went home after the war, and she got married, and she was able to get a position as a doctor, but it had to be part-time, and of course it was, you know, not paid nearly as well as the men because there was a rule that married women could not hold these positions as doctors at the hospital. So I think though that their war service paved the way going into the Second World War. Again, you had women much more active in the British workforce and military effort. And then after the Second World War in 1947, they made it a stipulation that any medical institution receiving state funding had to allow women admission to their schools. But the most interesting thing was, she kind of goes on that like 50s and 60s, there still wasn't really this big shift towards, you know, more women, you know, outnumbering men or about equal. It wasn't until the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act was passed in Great Britain that you start seeing the numbers leveling out. And it was around this time in the United States that you started seeing more women entering medical school. It's still kind of a problem today. They're finally starting to see, I know when my fiance, Matt, started at the University of Cincinnati several years ago now, you know, their white coat ceremony at the beginning of medical school where they're sort of, you know, inducted into this medical education. It was a big deal because their medical school class had more than 50% women. And I think that was the first time at that institution. And so they're starting to see it shift now. There's still, you know, pretty small percentage of women in the highest administrative roles, and especially in certain specialties too. I have a friend in surgery, and that field is still predominantly men. And even now, there are some difficulties faced by women in medicine. I hear it from my friends, I hear it from my fiance about his female coworkers, just, you know, people might treat them differently, or, you know, they just assume they're nurses, things like that. So there have been a lot of strides made since then, and they certainly laid this foundation for this slow progress. I think things are finally picking up now. She quoted one data kind of extrapolation that said by 2022, they think there'll now be 50% or even more than 50% women doctors in the field. I don't know if that's including medical students or not, because of course it takes a long time to be a full-blown attending. But yeah, and even, you know, looking back at Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell's time, it was only the mid 1800s, and it seems like a long time ago, but when you really start looking at all the years, a lot of progress has been made, but it's also still like, whoa, it's only in like the last 30 years that women have really gotten a good foothold in the medical field.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you to our attendees today, and thank you to our panelists for celebrating this 1-year anniversary of the Bookworm and letting us know what you've been reading and learning about. And hopefully we'll see everybody next week. Have a great weekend. I mean, next month. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.